The house felt emptier than I ever thought possible. Every room echoed with memories of Fred, his laughter in the kitchen, his quiet hum as he read in the living room, the way he used to kiss me goodbye before heading out for work. But now, those sounds were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. The absence of his presence was suffocating, a void so vast it seemed impossible to fill. I would catch myself pausing in the doorway of our bedroom, half expecting to see him there, only to be met with the cold reality that he wasn't coming back. James was struggling too. He had always been close to Fred, idolizing him in ways only a son could. After the funeral, he withdrew into himself, spending hours alone in his room or wandering aimlessly around the neighborhood. His grief manifested differently from mine, quieter but no less profound. Where I cried openly, he bottled everything up, retreating behind a wall of silence that I couldn't penetrate. I wanted to help him, to pull him back from whatever dark place he'd retreated to, but I didn't know how. How do you comfort someone when your own heart is shattered? So instead, I tried to fill the void in small ways, cooking his favorite meals, leaving notes on his desk, making sure he knew I was there if he needed me. At first, it seemed to work. Slowly, he began opening up, sharing fragments of his grief during late-night conversations when the rest of the world was asleep. We'd sit together on the couch, the TV turned low, and talk about Fred, his quirks, his kindness, the little things that made him unforgettable. For those fleeting moments, it almost felt like Fred was still with us, alive in our shared memories. But as we leaned on each other more and more, something shifted. What started as shared mourning began to feel different, closer, more intimate. It wasn't just the bond of mutual loss. It was something deeper, something neither of us acknowledged aloud but that lingered unspoken between us. James's hand would brush against mine as we passed in the hallway, and instead of pulling away, we'd let our fingers linger for just a moment longer than necessary. His gaze would meet mine across the dinner table, and for a heartbeat, it felt like he was seeing me, not just as his mother, but as someone else entirely. And though I told myself it was just two people clinging to each other in the wake of unimaginable loss, deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing tension between us. It was electric, charged with emotions neither of us dared to name. Guilt gnawed at the edges of my mind, whispering that this was wrong, that I should put distance between us before things spiraled further. But at the same time, there was a part of me, a selfish, aching part, that craved the connection James offered. In his eyes, I saw not just my son, but a reflection of my own loneliness, my own need for solace. One night, as we sat side by side on the couch watching an old movie Fred loved, James turned to me suddenly. "Do you think Dad would have wanted us to be this sad?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "No," I said finally. "He wouldn't. He'd want us to keep living, to find joy again." "But how?" James pressed, his eyes searching mine. "How do we move forward without forgetting him?" His words struck a chord deep within me, because they mirrored my own fears, my own uncertainty about what came next. I didn't have an answer for him, or for myself. So instead, I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of our shared grief hung in the air, thick and unspoken, but so did something else, a spark of understanding, of connection that went beyond words. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that the line between comfort and something more dangerous was beginning to blur. And while I told myself it was just grief binding us together, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something we might not be able to undo. One evening, as we sat side by side on the couch watching an old movie Fred loved, James turned to me suddenly. His voice broke, through the quiet hum of the television, soft but insistent, pulling me from the haze of my thoughts. "Do you think Dad would have wanted us to be this sad?" he asked, his tone barely above a whisper, yet heavy with meaning. I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. It wasn't something I had allowed myself to consider, not fully at least. The grief still felt too raw, too consuming, to imagine moving past it. But James' words struck a chord deep within me, forcing me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. Fred wouldn't have wanted this for us. He would have hated seeing us trapped in sorrow, unable to find joy in life again. "No," I said, finally, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "He wouldn't. He'd want us to keep living, to find joy again." James nodded slowly, his brow furrowed, as if he were wrestling with the same weight I carried. "But how?" he pressed, his eyes searching mine. "How do we move forward without forgetting him?" His question hung in the air between us, unanswered. How did we honor Fred's memory while finding a way to live without him? I didn't know. All I could offer was silence, and the warmth of my hand reaching out to take his. His fingers curled around mine, tentative but firm, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The room seemed smaller somehow, the distance between us shrinking as the shared weight of our grief pressed down on us. Yet beneath that heaviness, there was something else, a flicker of connection, fragile but undeniable. It wasn't just sadness binding us together. It was understanding, empathy, and perhaps even something more complicated, something neither of us was ready to name. Over the next few weeks, James began seeking me out more often. At first, I thought it was simply because he needed comfort, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his pain. But as the days passed, his presence became less about solace and more about closeness. He'd join me in the kitchen while I cooked, leaning against the counter and chatting about school or his plans for the future. Sometimes he'd sit beside me on the porch as we watched the sunset, his shoulder brushing mine in a way that made my breath catch. Other times, he'd linger in the doorway of my bedroom, watching me fold laundry or organize drawers, his gaze lingering longer than it should. At first, I told myself it was harmless. After all, what mother wouldn't welcome her son spending time with her? But there was an intensity to his attention that unsettled me, a kind of focus that went beyond familial affection. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, it was the way he watched. His eyes followed my movements, studying me with a softness that sent shivers down my spine. When he thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch him staring, his expression unreadable but charged with emotion. And when our eyes met, there was a spark, a fleeting moment of recognition that left my heart racing and my mind spinning. It wasn't just his gaze that unnerved me. It was the little things he said, the compliments that slipped out almost unconsciously. "You look nice today, Mom," he'd say as I stood at the sink washing dishes. Or, "You always make everything feel better." Each word was innocent enough on its own, but together, they created a pattern I couldn't ignore. They hinted at something deeper, something I didn't dare acknowledge. And then there were the moments when our physical proximity felt electric, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. One afternoon, as I reached for a bowl on a high shelf, James stepped behind me to help. His arm brushed mine, sending a jolt through my body that I couldn't suppress. I froze, pretending to focus on the task at hand, but I could feel his hesitation too. For a split second, neither of us moved, suspended in a space where boundaries blurred and unspoken feelings simmered just beneath the surface. These moments weren't constant, but they were frequent enough to leave me questioning everything. Was I imagining it, projecting my own loneliness onto him? Or was there truly something shifting between us, something dangerous and forbidden? The guilt gnawed at me, relentless and suffocating. This was my son, the child I had raised, the person I was supposed to protect above all else. Yet here I was, caught in a web of emotions I couldn't untangle. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word felt like a step across a line I shouldn't even be considering. But even as my rational mind screamed at me to pull away, to reinforce the boundaries that kept us safe, another part of me, a darker, more vulnerable part, wanted to lean in to see where this connection might lead. One night, as we sat together on the porch under a sky scattered with stars, James turned to me with an intensity that took my breath away. "I miss him so much," he said, his voice trembling. "But being with you, it helps. You make me feel like maybe I can get through this." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, both beautiful and devastating. I wanted to tell him he was strong enough to face this on his own, that he didn't need me to hold him up. But instead, I found myself pulling him into a hug, holding him tighter than I should have. As his arms wrapped around me, I felt the barrier between us crack, letting in a flood of emotions I wasn't prepared to handle. We stayed like that for longer than we should have, our bodies pressed close, our breaths mingling in the cool night air. When we finally pulled apart, his eyes locked onto mine, searching for something I didn't know how to give. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me, and God help me, a part of me wanted him to. But instead, he smiled faintly, his lips curving upward in a way that made my heart ache. "Thanks, Mom," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." I nodded, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Anytime, sweetheart." As he walked back inside, leaving me alone on the porch, I realized something terrifying. Whatever was happening between us wasn't going to stop unless one of us put an end to it. And I wasn't sure I was strong enough to be the one to walk away. It happened on a rainy night, the kind where the storm outside mirrors the turmoil inside. James and I were sitting in the living room, the flickering light of the fireplace casting shadows across the walls. We hadn't spoken much, content to simply exist in each other's company, but the air between us was charged, electric. The rain tapped insistently against the windows, a rhythmic reminder of the world beyond this fragile bubble we'd created. "You okay?" James asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, hesitant, yet laced with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly, betraying the lie. I wasn't fine, not really. The weight of everything unsaid hung heavy between us, pressing down on me until it felt like I might suffocate under its pressure. He leaned closer, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. "You don't have to pretend with me, Mom. I see you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Because he was right, I had been pretending, burying my pain beneath layers of routine and responsibility. But now, faced with the raw honesty in his eyes, I couldn't keep pretending. There was no hiding from him, no shielding myself from the truth he seemed determined to drag into the light. Before I could stop myself, I reached out, my fingers grazing his cheek. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into my touch, his eyes closing briefly as if savoring the moment. My heart raced, panic and desire warring within me, each emotion clawing for dominance. "This is wrong," I whispered, more to myself than to him. My rational mind screamed at me to pull back, to put distance between us before things spiraled further out of control. But my body refused to obey, rooted in place by the magnetic pull of his presence. "I know," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. His gaze locked onto mine, searching for something, permission, reassurance, maybe even absolution. "But it doesn't feel that way." And then, before either of us could second-guess ourselves, our lips met in a kiss that was equal parts tender and desperate. It was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid to fully commit to the act. But the hesitation quickly gave way to something deeper, more primal. His hands found their way to my waist, pulling me closer while mine tangled in his hair, holding him to me as if letting go would mean losing myself entirely. The world around us dissolved, the sound of the rain, the crackle of the fire, the ticking clock, all faded into white noise, leaving only the two of us suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. Every nerve in my body was alive, tingling with a mixture of guilt and exhilaration. This was wrong, so very wrong, but in that moment, it also felt undeniably right. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, reality came crashing back in. The weight of what we'd done settled over us like a suffocating blanket. James stared at me, his expression a mix of awe and fear. While I struggled to steady my breathing, my mind racing with thoughts of consequence and impossibility. "We shouldn't have done that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But even as the words left my lips, I knew they rang hollow. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. James nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know, but I don't regret it. Neither did I." And that terrified me more than anything else. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what we'd done crashed over me like a tidal wave. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest heaving as if I just surfaced from drowning. The weight of our actions pressed down on me, suffocating and undeniable. For a moment, neither of us moved, our bodies still close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him, a reminder of what had just transpired between us. "Oh God, James," I stammered, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst out of my chest. We shouldn't have." "I know," he interrupted, his voice trembling with a mixture of vulnerability and resolve. His eyes locked onto mine, searching for something, understanding, forgiveness, maybe even validation. "But I don't regret it." His honesty stunned me, cutting through the haze of guilt and confusion swirling inside me. Those 5 simple words hit me like a punch to the gut, forcing me to confront the truth I'd been trying so desperately to ignore. Neither did I. Not really. A part of me wanted to scream, to push him away, and lock myself in my room until the shame subsided. To pretend this night had never happened, that we hadn't crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But another part, a darker, more dangerous part, felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, a forbidden thrill that coursed through my veins like fire. "We can't let this happen again," I said firmly, though my resolve wavered under the intensity of his gaze. I tried to steady my voice, to sound convincing, but the words felt hollow even to my own ears. How could I deny the pull I felt toward him, when every fiber of my being seemed to crave his presence? "Why not?" he challenged softly, his tone almost pleading. There was no accusation in his voice, only a quiet desperation that mirrored my own inner turmoil. "It's not like anyone has to know." His words sent a shiver down my spine, both thrilling and horrifying me in equal measure. Because he was right, no one did have to know. We could bury this secret deep within ourselves, hidden behind closed doors and whispered promises. But that didn't make it any less wrong. This wasn't just some fleeting indiscretion. It was a betrayal of everything I believed in, everything I stood for. And yet, the thought of walking away from him, of severing this connection we'd forged in the darkness, filled me with an ache I couldn't bear. I opened my mouth to argue, to remind him, and myself, of all the reasons why this was impossible, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I found myself staring at him, drinking in the sight of his face, the way his hair fell messily across his forehead, the faint flush of color in his cheeks. He looked so young, so achingly beautiful, and yet there was a maturity in his expression, a depth of emotion that belied his age. In that moment, I realized how little I truly understood him, how much of him I'd taken for granted before tonight. "James," I began hesitantly, my voice barely above a whisper. Whatever this is, it's complicated, dangerous. People would judge us, hate us, if they ever found out. "I don't care about them," he said quickly, his tone firm despite the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "All I care about is you, us." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning, and I felt my defenses crumbling beneath their weight. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was my son, my responsibility, the person I was meant to protect above all else. Yet here we were, tangled together in a web of emotions neither of us fully understood, unable or unwilling to extricate ourselves. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other, the silence stretching taut like a bowstring ready to snap. Finally, I reached out, my hand brushing against his cheek in a gesture that was equal parts tender and desperate. "We need to be careful," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "If anyone finds out, they won't," he assured me, his fingers curling around mine, holding them tightly as if afraid I might pull away. "I promise." And though I knew I should resist, should put an end to this before it spiraled further out of control, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not now, not when the memory of his touch still lingered on my skin, when the taste of his kiss still lingered on my lips. So instead, I nodded, silently conceding to the unspoken agreement hanging between us. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days that followed were tense, filled with stolen glances and awkward silences. James tried to act normal, helping around the house and cracking jokes like he always did, but the air between us was heavy with unspoken longing. Every time our eyes met, there was an electric charge, a reminder of what we had shared, a secret that now hung over us like a storm cloud threatening to break. I could see it in the way he lingered in doorways or hesitated before speaking, as if he were weighing every word carefully. And I felt it too, a pull toward him that I fought against with every ounce of willpower I possessed. Finally, I decided we needed to talk. The weight of what had happened, and what might happen again, was becoming unbearable. It wasn't just about guilt. It was about protecting both of us from something that could destroy everything we held dear. So one evening, after dinner when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed distant, I found him sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the darkening sky. My heart clenched at the sight of him, so young yet carrying the same burden I carried. Taking a deep breath, I sat down beside him. "James," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "What happened between us? It can't happen again." For a moment, he didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his jaw tightening slightly as though bracing himself for impact. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes were a mixture of pain and resignation. He nodded slowly, though his expression betrayed his disappointment. "I get it," he said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "But it doesn't change how I feel." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't accusatory or angry. They were honest, raw, and achingly sincere. And they mirrored exactly how I felt. But acknowledging those feelings wouldn't make them right. If anything, it made them more dangerous. "And it doesn't change how I feel either," I admitted, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it even. "But we're family. There are lines we can't cross, no matter how strong the temptation." Even saying the words aloud felt like tearing apart a piece of myself. Because while logic screamed that this was the only path forward, my heart rebelled against the idea of letting go. James looked at me then, his eyes searching mine as if trying to memorize every detail. There was a depth to his gaze that went beyond his years, a maturity born not from experience but from emotion. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched taut between us, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I'll respect your decision," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "But I won't stop caring about you." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a promise. A promise I knew he meant with every fiber of his being. And maybe that's what made it hurt the most. The knowledge that no matter how hard we tried to move past this, the connection we shared would never fully fade. It wasn't just physical, it ran deeper than that. It was emotional, psychological, something woven into the fabric of who we were together. "I know," I replied softly, my throat tight with unshed tears. "And I care about you too, more than you realize. That's why we have to be careful, why we have to protect each other from ourselves." He nodded again, though I could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him wanted to argue, to fight for what we had, but another part, the stronger, wiser part, understood the stakes. We weren't just risking our relationship, we were risking our family, our future, our sanity. Crossing that line once had been reckless enough. Doing it again would be catastrophic. We sat there for a while longer, side by side, but worlds apart, the space between us charged with everything we couldn't say. Eventually, James stood, brushing off his jeans with a sigh. "Good night, Mom," he said, his tone lighter, but still tinged with melancholy. "Good night, sweetheart," I replied, watching as he walked back inside. As the screen door clicked shut behind him, I let out a shaky breath, resting my elbows on my knees and burying my face in my hands. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo what had been done or erase the feelings that lingered between us. All I could do was try to set boundaries, to enforce them, to remind myself daily of why this was necessary. But as I stared out at the night sky, the stars obscured by clouds, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, no matter how much I wanted it to be. Because love, no matter its form, isn't something you can simply turn off. In the weeks that followed, we worked hard to rebuild our bond, focusing on the things that had always brought us together: shared laughter, quiet moments, and the memory of Fred. It wasn't easy. The tension lingered, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed. Every interaction felt like walking a tightrope, each word weighed and measured before it left my lips. James tried to act normal, cracking jokes or helping around the house, as he always had, but there was an undercurrent to everything, a heaviness neither of us could ignore. I found myself hyper-aware of him in ways I hadn't been before. The way his hand brushed against mine when passing the salt at dinner. The way his laughter filled the room, warm and familiar yet tinged with something new, something unspoken. And then there were the moments when our eyes would meet across the table or in the hallway, brief flashes of connection that made my chest tighten. In those fleeting seconds, I saw the same longing reflected back at me, the pull of emotions we both fought so hard to suppress. But we held firm, determined not to let our grief and loneliness lead us astray again. We talked more openly about Fred, sharing stories and memories that reminded us of who we were before this tangled web began. Those conversations became a lifeline, grounding us in the reality of what mattered most: family, love, and healing. Slowly, we started to find a new rhythm, one built on mutual respect and careful distance. It wasn't perfect. There were days when the weight of what had happened threatened to overwhelm me, when the ache of missing Fred collided with the guilt of what James and I had done. On those nights, I'd sit by the window, staring out at the dark sky, wondering if we'd ever truly move past this. But even in those moments of doubt, I reminded myself why we had to try. Some lines, no matter how blurred, can never be uncrossed. Crossing them might feel right in the heat of the moment, but the consequences ripple outward, touching lives in ways we can't undo. James seemed to understand this too, though it clearly cost him. One evening, as we sat side by side on the couch watching an old movie, he turned to me with a seriousness that caught me off guard. "Mom," he began, his voice low, "do you think we'll ever get back to how things were?" I paused, considering his question. How could we go back? Too much had changed, too many words spoken, too many boundaries broken. But maybe going back wasn't the goal. Maybe the point was moving forward, together, but differently. "I don't know if we can go back," I admitted, finally meeting his gaze. "But I think we can build something new, something stronger." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I want that," he said softly. I miss Dad, and I miss feeling close to you without all this stuff between us." His honesty broke my heart. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Me too, sweetheart. But we have to do this the right way. For Fred, for ourselves, for everyone who loves us." We didn't say much after that, letting the silence settle around us like a cocoon. The movie played on in the background, its cheerful soundtrack a stark contrast to the heaviness in the room. Yet, despite everything, I felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in weeks, it seemed possible that we could navigate this together. As the days turned into months, our relationship began to shift. The sharp edges softened, the tension easing into something quieter, more manageable. We learned to communicate differently, to set boundaries that protected both of us from slipping back into dangerous territory. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was necessary. And through it all, we clung to the shared understanding that some mistakes, once made, demand a lifetime of effort to repair. Because sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing. And while I knew we'd carry the weight of what had happened for the rest of our lives, I also knew we were stronger for facing it head on. Together,